The carriage rattled over frozen roads as dawn broke pale and reluctant across the Scottish Highlands. Inside, wrapped in a travelling cloak too thin for the biting cold, sat a young woman whose hands had not stopped trembling since Edinburgh. Not from the winter air that seeped through every crack in the ancient vehicle, but from the weight of what she carried, a contract signed by her uncle, a debt settled in flesh rather than coin, and a future sealed before she had been allowed to speak a single word of protest. Her name was Amelia Wentworth, though she wondered if that name would matter by nightfall. By evening, she would become something else entirely, a duchess, a stranger's wife, a woman sold to satisfy gambling debts she had not incurred. 26 years she had lived in relative obscurity, the orphaned niece of a country gentleman whose fondness for cards had exceeded his wisdom. Now she would pay for his weakness with her life. The Duke of Stonebriar remained a mystery to her. She had never met him, never even glimpsed him across a ballroom or in the pages of society news. He existed only as a signature on parchment and whispered rumours among servants, a man of impossible wealth and glacial temperament who had lost his first wife under circumstances no one would speak of plainly. Some said she had thrown herself from the North Tower. Others claimed she had simply walked into the moors one winter morning and never returned. Amelia told herself these were only stories, the kind of Gothic tales that thrived in the absence of truth. But as the carriage climbed higher into the mountains, and Stonebriar Manor emerged from the mist like a cathedral carved from shadow and stone, she felt the stories wrap around her throat like cold fingers. The manor stood against the sky, as though it had been grown from the rock itself rather than built by human hands. 4 stories of dark granite rose in severe lines, their windows narrow and lightless, their towers sharp as accusations. Bare trees clawed at the walls, like supplicants begging entrance, and the formal gardens, now surrendered to winter, sprawled in geometric patterns that suggested order, imposed upon chaos through sheer force of will. Amelia descended from the carriage with legs that barely held her weight. A servant appeared, elderly and silent, his livery impeccable, but his expression carefully blank. He did not speak, only gestured toward the massive oak doors that stood open like a mouth prepared to swallow her whole. The entrance hall stretched before her in shadows and marble. Portraits lined the walls, generations of severe faces staring down with expressions ranging from disapproval to outright hostility. The air smelled of beeswax and something older, something like grief that had soaked into the stones and would not be scrubbed away. At the far end of the hall, a figure stood silhouetted against the weak light filtering through a window. He did not move as she approached, did not offer greeting or welcome, only watched her draw closer with a stillness that felt predatory. When she was near enough to see his face clearly, Amelia's breath caught. He was younger than she had imagined, perhaps 35, with dark hair touched with silver at the temples, and eyes of such pale grey they seemed almost colourless in the dim light. His features were aristocratic in the extreme, all sharp angles and austere planes, as though his face had been carved by the same harsh wind that shaped the Highlands. He was handsome in the way that winter itself is beautiful, cold, remote, capable of killing without malice. She curtsied with a grace her governess would have approved, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Your Grace, I am Amelia Wentworth." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I know who you are." His voice was deep and measured, each word weighted with an authority that expected no contradiction. He moved closer, circling her slowly as though she were a horse he was considering purchasing. Amelia kept her spine straight and her gaze forward, refusing to flinch under his examination, even as humiliation burned in her chest. "Your uncle described you as plain," he said at last. He was either blind or deliberately deceptive. Amelia blinked, uncertain whether she had been complimented or insulted. The Duke stopped before her, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and leather that clung to his coat. "We will be married this evening. The ceremony will be private. You will have 3 hours to prepare." He turned as though to dismiss her, then paused. "There is no need for pretense between us, Miss Prescott. This is a transaction, nothing more. You require rescue from destitution. I require an heir. Let us at least have the dignity of honesty." The words landed like blows, though his tone had not been unkind, merely matter-of-fact. Emilia lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of pride she had not known she possessed. "I understand perfectly, Your Grace. I did not expect romance from a business arrangement." Something flickered in his pale eyes, gone too quickly to identify. "Good. Then we will manage well enough." A housekeeper appeared as though summoned by thought alone, a woman of perhaps 60 with iron-grey hair and a face that suggested she had forgotten how to smile decades ago. "This is Mrs. Blackwood. She will show you to your chambers and assist with preparations." Emilia followed the housekeeper up a grand staircase that curved like a spine, down corridors that seemed to stretch into darkness regardless of the lamps burning at intervals along the walls. The silence pressed against her ears, broken only by the whisper of their skirts and the distant sound of wind against stone. The chambers she was given occupied the east wing. They were beautifully appointed in shades of deep blue and silver, with a canopied bed large enough for 3 people and windows that overlooked the wild gardens and the moors beyond. A fire burned in the grate, but the warmth did not seem to penetrate the chill that lived in the walls themselves. Mrs. Blackwood moved through the room with practiced efficiency, laying out garments that had been prepared in advance. The wedding gown was exquisite, layers of ivory silk and delicate lace that must have cost a small fortune. Emilia stared at it, unable to reconcile such beauty with the cold transaction that would follow. "Did the Duke select this himself?" she asked quietly. The housekeeper's hand stilled for just a moment. "He did, miss. Specified every detail, down to the pearls at the cuff." She resumed her work, her voice carefully neutral. "His Grace has very particular tastes." Emilia touched the silk with tentative fingers. "And his first wife? Did she wear something similar?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Mrs. Blackwood straightened, her expression hardening into the practiced blank of a servant who has learned which questions not to answer. "We do not speak of the previous Duchess in this house, miss. Not out of disrespect, but out of necessity. Some griefs are best left undisturbed." Before Emilia could press further, the housekeeper withdrew, leaving her alone with the beautiful gown and the growing certainty that she had entered a house where silence was not merely preferred, but enforced. The ceremony took place in the Manor's private chapel as the winter sun died behind the mountains. No guests attended, only the Duke, Emilia, the elderly priest who spoke the words with mechanical precision, and 2 servants who served as witnesses. The chapel itself was small and austere, its stone walls bare of ornamentation, save for a single stained glass window depicting a scene Emilia could not quite identify in the failing light. She stood beside a man she did not know and repeated vows that felt like lies even as she spoke them. The Duke's responses were clear and unwavering, his hand steady as he slipped a ring of gold and rubies onto her finger. The weight of it felt like a shackle. When the priest pronounced them man and wife, the Duke did not kiss her. He simply nodded once, offered his arm with formal courtesy, and led her from the chapel into a dining room where a wedding supper had been laid for 2. They ate in silence, an elaborate meal of roasted pheasant and winter vegetables that Emilia could barely taste through her anxiety. The Duke consumed his food with the same careful precision he seemed to bring to everything, never hurrying, never speaking, his pale eyes occasionally lifting to observe her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, Emilia set down her fork. "May I ask a question, Your Grace?" "You may ask." "Whether I answer depends on the question. Why did you agree to this arrangement? Surely a man of your station could have made a match with any number of willing families. Why purchase a bride from a desperate gambler?" He took a slow sip of wine, considering her over the rim of the glass. "Perhaps I preferred a bride who would be grateful rather than ambitious. Or perhaps I simply found the terms acceptable." The evasion was obvious, but Emilia let it pass. She had no right to demand his secrets when she had none of her own to offer in exchange. As the meal concluded, and the servants cleared the dishes away, the Duke rose from his chair. "It is late. I will escort you to your chambers." Emilia's throat tightened. She had known this moment would come, had steeled herself for whatever duties would be required of her, but the reality of it pressed down like a physical weight. She stood, smoothing her skirts with hands that would not quite steady, and followed him from the dining room. They climbed the grand staircase in silence, their shadows stretching long and strange on the walls. When they reached the corridor that led to her chambers, the Duke surprised her by continuing past them. She hesitated, confused, but he glanced back with an expression she could not read. "Your rooms are comfortable, I trust?" "Yes, Your Grace. They will serve as your private chambers." He stopped before a different door, one carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the lamplight. "These are the Duchess's chambers. They have been prepared for you." He pushed open the door, revealing a suite even more magnificent than the one she had dressed in. The walls were covered in silk the color of midnight, and the furniture was dark wood inlaid with mother of pearl. A fire roared in a hearth large enough to stand in, and the bed, God, the bed was a masterpiece of carved mahogany draped in velvet the color of wine. Emilia stepped inside, her heart pounding so violently she was certain he must hear it. The Duke followed, closing the door behind them with a soft click that seemed to seal her fate. She turned to face him, calling on every ounce of courage she possessed. "I will do my duty, Your Grace. I ask only for patience if I am inexperienced in these matters." He moved closer, and Emilia forced herself not to retreat. His hand lifted, and she tensed, expecting his touch. Instead, he reached past her to the high collar of her gown, his fingers finding a small clasp she had not known was there. With a gentle tug, he released it, and the silk parted, revealing not skin, but a hidden pocket sewn into the lining. From it, he withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. Emilia stared in confusion as he unfolded the fabric, revealing a miniature portrait. The painting was old, the colors slightly faded, but the face it depicted was unmistakable. A young girl, perhaps 12, with dark curls and serious eyes, wearing a simple dress that marked her as gentry rather than nobility. The girl was Emilia herself, painted years ago by an itinerant artist her father had commissioned shortly before his death. Her breath stopped entirely. "Where did you get that?" The Duke's voice when he spoke had changed. The ice had not. Melted, but beneath it she heard something else, something that trembled with an emotion she could not name. "From your father. He gave it to me 14 years ago, when I was a young man traveling through Somerset, when I stopped at your family's estate seeking shelter from a storm. I stayed 3 days. You were still a child, all wild curls and paint-stained fingers, showing me your drawings of the garden flowers and asking 1,000 questions about the world beyond your father's lands." Emilia's mind reeled, grasping for memories she had locked away after her father's death. A visitor, tall and quiet, who had listened to her childish chatter with more patience than anyone else, who had walked with her through the gardens and told her stories of the Highlands, who had looked at her father's collection of books with the reverence of a scholar rather than the dismissive boredom most gentlemen displayed. "You," she whispered. "You were there. I told your father I would return." The Duke's hand closed around the miniature, his knuckles white. "I promised him that when you were old enough, if you would have me, I would ask for your hand properly. But when I returned 2 years later, he was dead, and you had vanished into the care of relatives I could not trace. I searched, Emilia. For years I searched." His voice roughened, cracking through the careful control he had maintained. "When your uncle contacted me through an intermediary, offering your hand in exchange for his debts, I knew it was you immediately. The description, the age, even the mention of Somerset, everything aligned. I purchased those debts not to trap you, but to find you, to finally keep the promise I made to your father and to myself." Emilia could not breathe, could not think, could only stare at this man who had been a stranger an hour ago, and was now somehow the answer to a question she had not known she was asking. "But you were so cold, so distant. I thought you despised this arrangement. I despise that you came to me in chains rather than choice. He stepped closer, and his hand, still holding the miniature, lifted to cup her face with a tenderness that contradicted everything she had seen of him. I despise that your first impression of me was as a man who buys women like cattle. I wanted to be the man from your childhood who made you laugh, not the Duke who frightened you into compliance. The ice in his eyes had melted entirely now, leaving behind something raw and vulnerable. I have waited 14 years for you, Amelia Wentworth. I have built my fortune, expanded my holdings, done everything necessary to become worthy of the girl who once trusted me with her dreams. And when you finally stood before me today, I could not find the words to tell you that this was not a cage I was placing you in, but the home I have spent years preparing. Tears spilled down Amelia's cheeks, hot against the cold that had gripped her all day. You should have told me. I was afraid. His admission came, quietly, almost a whisper, afraid that you would not remember, afraid that you would remember and be disappointed by what I had become, afraid that revealing myself too soon would make you feel obligated by sentiment rather than choice. I wanted you to agree to this marriage believing it was merely business, so that later, when I showed you the truth, you could decide freely whether to accept the man beneath the title. Amelia reached up, covering his hand with her own. You are an absolute fool, Your Grace. His eyes widened slightly, and despite everything, despite the tears and confusion and overwhelming rush of memory and emotion, Amelia laughed. A broken, watery sound, but genuine. I have spent 14 years with a half-forgotten memory of a kind stranger who treated me as though my thoughts mattered, who listened to my childish dreams of becoming an artist and did not mock them, who looked at me not as a commodity or a burden, but as a person. She turned her face into his palm, pressing a kiss to his wrist. I agreed to marry you believing I was selling myself to a cold stranger, and I was prepared to endure it. How dare you let me suffer through that wedding, thinking I was sacrificing everything, when all along you were offering me everything. His other hand came up to frame her face, thumbs brushing away her tears. I am sorry. God, Amelia, I am so deeply sorry. I thought I was being noble, giving you space to acclimate before revealing myself. I did not realize I was being cruel. She should have been angry. Perhaps she was, in some small corner of her heart. But the larger truth overwhelmed everything else. The truth that the cold Duke was the kind stranger, that the transaction was a reunion, that the cage was a home prepared with 14 years of patient longing. And suddenly, the weight of the day, the fear and resignation and grief transformed into something else entirely. Into relief so profound it made her dizzy, into hope that blazed like the fire in the hearth, into the first fragile threads of something that might, with time and care, become love. The Duke, her husband, searched her face with desperate intensity. Can you forgive me? Amelia considered the question seriously, because he deserved that much. Then she rose onto her toes and kissed him, softly, tentatively, the first free choice she had made all day. When she pulled back, she saw wonder in his eyes. Ask me again in the morning, she whispered, after you have told me everything. All the years between that summer and this winter, every moment of your search, every reason for your coldness, every truth you have kept locked away. He nodded, solemn and steady. I will tell you everything. I swear it. Then I suspect I will forgive you, Amelia said, allowing herself the first genuine smile since Edinburgh. I am told I have a distressingly forgiving nature. Though you will have to work considerably harder to move from forgiven to trusted, I will spend every day earning that. Trust. His voice carried the weight of a vow more binding than the one spoken in the chapel. Every day for the rest of our lives. They stood there in the firelight, still learning the shape of each other's faces, still strangers in so many ways despite the connection that bound them. Outside, snow had begun to fall, blanketing the wild gardens in white, muffling the world into softness. Amelia leaned into her husband's warmth and allowed herself, for the first time since the carriage had carried her away from everything she knew, to believe that perhaps she had not been sold into captivity after all. Perhaps she had been guided home. The days that followed, moved with the slow deliberation of a house learning to breathe again. Emilia woke each morning in the Duchess's chambers, always alone, always with sunlight filtering through the heavy curtains, despite the winter gloom outside. The Duke, she learned, rose before dawn and spent his mornings managing the vast machinery of his estates, but he left signs of his presence. A book he thought she might enjoy on the table beside her bed. Fresh flowers despite the season, hothouse roses that must have cost a small fortune. Once, a sketch pad and charcoals, a reference to a conversation she barely remembered from childhood. She found him each afternoon in the library, a magnificent room lined floor to ceiling with volumes that smelled of leather and paper and time. He would be seated at the great desk, correspondence spread before him, but when she entered, he would set aside his work without complaint, as though her company was the appointment he had been waiting for all morning. They talked, hours of conversation that meandered through memory and revelation, building the bridge between who they had been and who they were becoming. He told her of his search, the investigators he had hired, the false leads that had taken him to 3 different countries, the frustration of pursuing shadows. He spoke of the guilt that had consumed him after his first wife's death, though he still would not detail the circumstances, only that he had failed her in ways that haunted him. Emilia listened and began to understand that the coldness she had perceived was not cruelty but armor, protection against the vulnerability of hope, repeatedly disappointed. In turn, she told him of her years after her father's death, the slow diminishment of her circumstances as her uncle's gambling debts mounted, the way she had been shifted from household to household, more burden than family, until she had learned to make herself small and quiet and useful. The dreams of becoming an artist that had withered in the absence of encouragement or means. She spoke of the fear that had gripped her in the carriage, the certainty that she was being delivered into a different kind of prison, perhaps gentler but no less confining. As she spoke, his hands would clench into fists, his jaw tightening with barely contained rage at those who had diminished her, but he never interrupted, never tried to minimize her experience or rush her toward forgiveness. He simply listened, bearing witness to her suffering with the same careful attention he had given her childish drawings 14 years ago. Slowly, carefully, trust began to grow between them. Not the instant passionate love of fairy tales, but something more solid, built from honesty and the patient accumulation of small kindnesses. He showed her the hidden corners of the manor, the library's secret alcove where the best light fell for reading, the conservatory where orchids bloomed in defiance of winter, the tower room he had converted into a studio with north-facing windows perfect for painting. The studio took her breath away. It was filled with supplies, easels and canvases, oils and watercolors, brushes of every size, pigments in a rainbow of glass jars. A small fortune invested in a dream he had remembered from a conversation years ago. "This is too much," she whispered, running her fingers over the smooth wood of an easel. "You cannot possibly expect me to accept this." He stood in the doorway, watching her with an expression that was learning to soften. "I have spent 14 years building a fortune I had no particular use for. Let me spend it on giving you back the dreams that were stolen. If you never touch a brush, these supplies will sit here unchanged and I will not complain. But if you wish to paint, I want you to have everything you need." Emilia turned to face him, tears pricking her eyes. "Why? Why do all of this for someone you barely know anymore?" "Because I knew you once, and that girl deserved better than what life gave her." He moved into the room, his hands behind his back in that formal posture that was slowly relaxing in her presence. "Because I spent years imagining what I would say if I found you again, how I would apologize for not returning sooner, how I would try to make amends for promises broken. Because giving you this costs me nothing but brings you joy, and I have discovered that your joy is rapidly becoming the measure by which I evaluate everything." She crossed the room and took his hands, pulling them from behind his back and holding them between her own. "You are not responsible for my suffering. You were barely more than a boy yourself when you visited my father. You made no promises to me, only to him. and his death released you from that obligation. I do not require rescue or recompense." "Then what do you require?" he asked quietly. "Time," she said. "Time to learn who you are now, not who you were. Time to let you learn who I have become. Time to build something real between us, not based on childhood memory or guilt or transaction, but on the people we actually are." He nodded slowly. "I can give you that. I can give you all the time you need. But," and she smiled, the first truly playful expression she had allowed herself in his presence, "perhaps you could also kiss me occasionally." "I find I quite like the first one and would not object to repeating the experience." Something shifted in his expression, the careful control cracking to reveal heat beneath the ice. "That can certainly be arranged." He pulled her closer, one hand rising to cup her face in that gesture that was becoming familiar. "Though I warn you, if we begin down that path, I may find it difficult to maintain the respectful distance I have been attempting." "I am not asking for distance," Emilia said, rising onto her toes. "I am asking for partnership, for honesty, for the chance to choose you freely every day until choosing you becomes as natural as breathing." He kissed her then, deeper than the first time, with a hunger held carefully in check but no longer hidden. Emilia melted into him, her hand sliding up to tangle in his hair, her body pressing against his with an instinct she had not known she possessed. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, he rested his forehead against hers. "You are going to be the death of me," he murmured. "Good," she replied. "Then we will be even." The winter deepened, but inside Stonebriar Manor, something was thawing. The servants began to smile in Emilia's presence, their careful neutrality warming into genuine respect as they saw how their master softened in her company. Mrs. Blackwood even unbent enough to share the manor's history, the generations of dukes who had built and expanded, and occasionally nearly ruined the estate, the scandals and triumphs that soaked into the stones. Emilia learned to navigate the vast house, discovering its rhythms and secrets. She found the music room, where a pianoforte sat silent and dusty, and she spent hours coaxing it back into voice. She explored the portrait gallery and demanded the stories behind each face, amused when the Duke proved to have a wickedly dry wit in describing his more ridiculous ancestors. She began to paint again, tentatively at first, afraid that years of disuse had stolen her skill, but gradually finding the rhythm of it returning to her hands. The Duke would sometimes sit in the studio while she worked, reading or attending to correspondence, his presence a comfortable weight in her peripheral vision. Other times he would watch her openly, studying the way she moved, the concentration that narrowed her world to canvas and color. "You are staring," she said one afternoon without looking up from the landscape she was attempting. "I am admiring. There is a difference." She glanced at him over her shoulder, one eyebrow raised. "And what exactly are you admiring? The way you forget to be careful when you paint? The way you stop monitoring yourself for mistakes and just create?" He set aside his book and moved to stand behind her, close enough that she could feel his warmth. "You do that more and more often now. Stop performing caution and start simply existing." "Does it please you?" she asked, honest curiosity in her voice. "Enormously." His hand settled on her shoulders, gentle but possessive. "It means you are beginning to trust that this is your home, not a stage where you must audition for the right to stay." Emilia set down her brush and turned in his arms, tilting her face up to his. "I do trust that. I trust you." The words came easier now, no longer weighted with fear or hesitation. "You have been patient and kind and honest, even when honesty revealed your vulnerabilities. How could I not trust that?" He kissed her softly, a benediction rather than a demand. "Then my patience has been worth every moment of restraint. Though I confess, that restraint grows more difficult by the day." She smiled against his lips. "Then perhaps it is time to stop restraining." They made love that night for the first time, a slow and tender exploration that erased the last shadows of transaction from their union. Emilia discovered that beneath his careful control, the Duke was passionate and generous, attentive to her comfort and pleasure in ways she had not known to expect. And afterward, Lying tangled together in the great bed while the fire burned low, she felt the final pieces of her heart settle into place. This man, with his tragic past and careful present and hopeful future, was hers. Not because of contracts or debts or childhood promises, but because they had chosen each other freely, seeing clearly, holding nothing back. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. The words surprised her as much as they must have surprised him, unplanned and utterly sincere. I do not know when it happened, somewhere between the studio and the library, and these quiet evenings learning your face. But I love you, and I needed you to know. His arms tightened around her. "I have loved you since you were 12 years old, and showed me a drawing of a flower you swore was a rose but looked more like a cabbage." His voice was rough with emotion. "I have loved you through 14 years of searching and hoping and fearing I would never find you. I have loved you through every moment since you stepped out of that carriage, looking terrified and proud, and so unbearably beautiful I forgot how to breathe. Emilia, you have been the fixed star by which I have navigated my entire adult life." She turned in his arms, needing to see his face. "Then we have been extraordinarily foolish, wasting weeks on careful courtesy when we could have been doing this." He laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. "We were building a foundation, ensuring that when we finally reached this moment, it would be solid enough to support everything that comes after." She kissed him, long and slow and full of promise. "And is it solid enough?" He rolled her beneath him, his body covering hers with a possessiveness that thrilled rather than frightened. "My darling wife," he murmured against her throat, "I suspect we could build an empire on this foundation." As winter gave way to the first uncertain promises of spring, Emilia Stonebriar, Duchess, artist, beloved wife, stood at the window of her studio and watched the moors begin to green. Behind her, she could hear her husband's approaching footsteps, as familiar now as her own heartbeat. She turned to greet him, paint-smudged and smiling, no longer the frightened woman sold to a cold stranger, but a woman who had found her home in the most unexpected of places, in a man who had waited 14 years to keep a promise, in a house that had forgotten joy but was slowly remembering, in a marriage that had begun in ice and fear, but had thawed into something rare and precious, a love chosen freely, built patiently, and worth every moment of the wait. He entered the studio and she went to him. No hesitation, no uncertainty, only the sure knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. And as he pulled her close, as he kissed her with the passion that no longer surprised but still delighted her, Emilia sent a silent thanks to the girl she had been at 12, who had charmed a young man with her terrible drawings and endless questions. That girl had planted a seed without knowing it, and it had grown through darkness and distance into something beautiful. Some love stories begin with thunderbolts and instant recognition, but theirs had been a seed planted in childhood, dormant through years of separation, finally breaking through the frozen ground to bloom in its own perfect time. And that, Emilia thought as her husband led her from the studio toward their chambers, toward the life they were building, one choice at a time, was perhaps the truest kind of love story there was. Thank you for watching this story to the end. Like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching from.